Long before the prophecy was written, before werewolves and vampires were even born, the land still believed itself safe. Now that belief is gone. From beneath the ground, creatures of the underworld, born of malice and suffering, are now free. Their footsteps trample the plants and darken the soil. They are coming. Across distant hills and cracked roads, their thunderous march shakes the ground. Stone trembled and trees groaned, while towns and villages stood frozen with dreadful knowing. Doors were barred, candles were dimmed, and those who listened at their windows heard their demise approaching. Fear took over while the horror grew with every echoing step. However, the land would not be at its full strength to face the evil that comes on this dark, stormy night. For Ragnar the White Wolf and Eleanor the Elf Lord had departed. They journeyed to the land of Freya bearing the fallen Berthold, hoping to perform the last rites befitting a valiant warrior and a dear friend. Thus, as doom advanced, 3 of the land's greatest warriors would be absent. And yet, even as despair tightens the grip it has on the land, death himself does not stand idle. For the Grim Reaper watches more than the departure of souls. And in the shadow of the coming storm, a plan was set in motion. For not all hope has been lost. Not when Belru Caesar, the legendary special class werewolf, and Mournrog the Hellhound, born of flame and darkness, still draws breath. As the first wave of monsters march forward, the Grim Reaper watches from a mountaintop while lightning flashes within his hollow eye sockets as the battle for the human land begins. Chapter 1. The Hellborn Monsters. They march with more than 1,000. Tall, slender, pale creature-like men with few strands of long hair on their peeling scalps. They are ashen in color, like their skin had been burnt for too long. Their teeth long and sharp to the point of it not being able to fit in their mouth. These were the Hellborn monsters, with eyes red and hollow. Their cleavers made from jagged slabs of silver bolted to handles. Spears with tips of barbed bone and silver wire. Shields hammered with grave iron, poorly crafted and irregular. However, they cared not for how heavy they were or how ugly they looked, for these weapons were not made of honor, rather the intent to kill. Their armor just the same but strong enough to wither an attack. They march through the forest banging their weapons against their shields. And so they chant, their words not of mumbles or growls, grunts or snorts. Rather, the chants are in Latin for the Hellborn monsters were sapient beings, capable of reasoning, logic, and planning. They fall into formation on their march like their master was right behind them. Pulling silver chains with hooks attached to the ends, they push through the forest. These Hellborn creatures were the first wave of monsters. Death stands tall on the mountaintop, looking ahead at the horde coming to the human land. Myra, the witch of Redwater, stood frozen, mortified at the sight her eyes hold on to. How many are there? She asks nervously. Without hesitation, the Grim Reaper with fiery eyes replied, 1,500. I counted 1,500, but there could be more. No snarky remark, no follow-up joke. Death was serious as he has ever been. Lancelot the Goblin asks,
Where do you think they are headed?
Myra answered, Surely it cannot be Redwater. My home is the largest landmass in the continent. There are at least 20 times more people than 1,500 Hellborn. My land is filled with witches, not forgetting Fillion with the Redwater police force. Meanwhile, Belru Caesar stood tall and strong. His glowing white eyes do not falter even for a second. He studied the Hellborn's movements, how they walked, the way they moved and communicated. Then he takes a bite of his apple. Mournrog the Hellhound did the same. His red eyes were focused on the Hellborn army. Despite the rain soaking his black fur dropping down his face, he doesn't blink. Then there was a faint bellow from the hound, showing his impatience to attack these creatures once and for all. The Reaper replies to the goblin's question. They are heading to Houndsville, home to werewolves. Houndsville, Myra asks as she covers her head with the hood of her purple cloak. Yeah, Houndsville. The Monster Council has Dracula and the City of Vampires in their back pocket. Why wouldn't they want to get werewolves as well? The goblin, with a glimmer of hope in his large eyes, says,
Well, that's perfect. The werewolves of Houndsville can fight with us. Natural-born werewolves may not be as strong, but in numbers, they are formidable.
No, the Reaper replied, though his focus still didn't move from the monsters in the distance. We need to relocate the folk of Houndsville as quickly as possible. Myra, confused but respectfully, said, Forgive me, but maybe the goblin does have a point.
When I speak, do none of you listen to me.
The witch and the goblin could not tell which had been more frightening, Death's voice or the thundercrack that followed. Then he calmed down and explained. Natural-born werewolves have been on the sidelines for a very long time. They are the weaker race of werewolves. Those men live in secrecy and isolation due to the law of the land, and they only do it to be accepted by human folk. What do you think happens when hell gets to them? What happens when the chip on their shoulder grows into a log, filled with poison and manipulation to prove themselves? The Reaper pointed to the Hellborn monsters below in the distance, then says, That's why they're carrying silver weapons. The Hellborn are going to beat up those men into submission. Steel is much stronger and more durable, yet Hell has given these creatures silver weapons, perfect for hunting werewolves. The Grim Reaper then pulled out a pocket watch and glanced at the time. 2 hours, he says. The Hellborn monsters will reach the land of Houndsville in 2 hours. Lancelot asks,
Sir, or sire, or that sir, why don't you just go down there and snap your fingers and poof, the Hellborn monsters will be gone?
I cannot, Death replied while looking at the stone that he was standing on.
Huh? Why not?
This time, however, Belru Caesar, almost done with his apple, had replied, The Reaper is bound to the law of the universe. He cannot kill any human or human-turned-monster. Myra gasped in astonishment. So that is why you've taught Ragnar how to use your scythe, she said. You could not defeat conquest, famine, or war on your own, for they too, much like yourself, were once human. The goblin then chimed in.
And that is why he cannot fight the Hellborn, for they were once men turned into monsters in the fire pits of hell.
The Grim Reaper grew impatient and annoyed. That's enough of this chatter. Houndsville has 5 main villages. Hellborns, they are smart. They will attack each village in groups. Then he looked at the witch deep in her eyes, still unaware if he could trust her or not. Tell me, witch, will you be able to defend an entire village by yourself? Myra never answered immediately. She was afraid. In fact, all of them should have been. It wasn't that the battle couldn't be won, rather the loss of human life that came with it. Yes, she said once composed. Good, the Reaper replied. Mournrog will take the 2nd village with the goblin. Belru will take the 3rd, closer to the woods. There'll be more Hellborn in that region. Myra then asked, But that's only 3 villages covered. What about the other 2? If one town has no protection but is vacant, then they would move along. As for the last village, I have someone in mind, though I know not if he would agree. Gather your wits and plan your attacks carefully, for at midnight, the battle begins. And so the allies parted ways, heading towards their respective villages they would protect, while Death would have to relocate and evacuate the folk of Houndsville. However, there were two more things the Reaper would have to do. Firstly, find and ask the ace up his sleeve if he would help. Normally, Taker would be more than strong enough to take on this task, but he was busy with work, for Purgatory was upside down. Secondly, Death would have to close the portal the Hellborn had come from, a task that sounded simple but was anything but easy. The Hellborn in their horde of monsters only walked the earth because of the Crones. Death had always thought lesser of them, but for the Crones to open up a portal large and strong enough to sustain 1,500 Hellborn as the first wave of monsters, then they were levels above his assumption. While the allies prepare for battle, Death will have to go up against the strongest, most evil witches in history. A battle of dark magic against the King of Darkness himself. Chapter 2. The Hellhound. When the Hellhound and the Goblin reached the first village of Houndsville, they saw it had been emptied, though the candles and the lanterns were left burning to give the illusion of occupation. The Grim Reaper was successful in his task, and that too, just before the midnight hour. Mournrog had noticed that in the past couple of days, Death has been rather secretive. That too for good reason. The death of the Dwarven warrior had blindsided them all. More so, why was there a sense of uneasiness looming in the air? Someone had obviously tipped off war, revealing the location of Bertold in the Redwater forest. The Redwater forest was so large that no supernatural being would just magically show up in that exact same spot. Maybe all this time the allies were being watched. A spy sent from the underworld, perhaps. Or maybe one of their own was hiding more that meets the eye. Nevertheless, Mournrog and Lancelot had their own plan in dealing with the Hellborn. The village houses in Houndsville were tall and sophisticated. The pathways were narrow with tight corners. Maneuvering around them for a hound as large as Mournrog would not be so easy. Lancelot stood in the center of the village in the pouring rain. He shivered, but it wasn't from the cold, rather from the fear coursing through his veins. He knew the Hellborn very well. After all, it was their kind that would beat him up in the dark dungeons of hell when Mournrog was away. But now there wasn't anything to be afraid of, not when the Goblin has the Hellhound as a friend. A beast larger than a bull moose and much faster than a horse. After flashes of lightning and a few thundercracks, Lancelot's eyes widened with shock. 450 Hellborn stood at the entrance of the village. They do not bang their weapons against their shields anymore. They don't chant or perform battle cries. Rather, they laugh and point at the goblin creature in front of them. They march towards him in unison, with their battle stances retreated. Then the Hellborn monster at the front crossed his arms and said,
Well, well, well. Look what we have here, gentlemen. It seems the goblin servant is residing in Houndsville.
More laughter followed by mockery. Mournrog, however, was stealthily making his way around the Hellborn towards the village entrance. The hound could not be seen before the attack, or these monsters would flee or disperse into other towns and villages, something the allies were not prepared for. With his large body, he moves as silently as possible. The storm was indeed in his favor. The Hellborn would not hear his monstrous footsteps drowned out by the thunder. They would not see his black fur covering muscle upon muscle. His red eyes move in the darkness behind the village houses. And so the Hellborn continued.
What shall we do with him, boys? Kill him. Beat him up the way we used to do in the dungeon. Spit on the floor and ask him to mop it up.
Mournrog had now shown his gnarly teeth, but only the night could see it. The Hellhound would have to endure the insults, striking his friend like stones. Just a few more minutes. Lancelot began backing up as all the horrific memories had returned. Then the Hellborn said,
Or better yet, we take him to Zalza for his insubordination and watch the higher demon make an example out of him.
But then, the Hellborn were not laughing anymore. They heard a deep growl, slow, lingering, and ominous. They felt it vibrating their bellies and crawling up towards their throats. A bellow so deep it begins to shake the very ground they stand on. Slowly and reluctantly they turned around with fear and panic-stricken expressions. For now the Hellhound was behind them, angrier than he had ever been. The night would hide him no longer. His anger and hunger would deny him no further. Mournrog's eyes pierced the night with a smoldering red, and then he opened his mouth, showing his monstrous teeth. And before the Hellborn monsters could even breathe, Mournrog pounced on them. Their fear was justified. What would a horde of Hellborn even do to Mournrog when the Hound was known as the Angel Slayer? Mournrog devoured at least 2 to 3 monsters in a single bite. He shook his head side to side rapidly, breaking their bones. However, shortly after, only the upper half of their bodies remained in the Hound's mouth, while the lower halves were torn off, flung in the air. Then the rest tried to run while Lancelot sprinted to safety with his tiny feet. The Hound took a swipe at them with his massive paw, sending them flying across the village. That impact alone of the Hellborn slamming against the village houses was enough to maim and dismantle them. From 450, their numbers began decreasing rapidly. All the suffering the goblin endured from these filthy creatures was being paid back tenfold. Mournrog was relentless in his onslaught. The Hellborn monsters were such vile and despicable creatures that even a hound would not fully devour them. A leap from Mournrog was enough to cover the distance the Hellborn had run to. Their weapons of silver, spears of barbed bone, and shields of grave iron were no match for the Hound. Now only their mangled monster bodies remain on the village ground, like they were part of the soil all along. A few of them did get away though, but they were heading towards the village Myra was defending. And so the goblin jumped and mounted Mournrog as they made haste towards said village, hoping the sounds of the Hellborn monsters being torn apart was drowned out by the vicious storm that night had brung. Chapter 3. The Witch. Myra had dealt with about 200 Hellborn monsters, though those numbers never bothered her, for the Witch of Redwater was not alone. Specializing in powers of space and time, Myra could open up portals to teleport, transport, and summon. Many witches in Redwater have attempted magic of that caliber, but some of them found it too difficult, while others died trying. The witch had summoned her giant snake known as Nala. The dark purple serpent slithered through the village, wrapping up the Hellborn with her slippery body and squeezing the life out of them. Each time the monsters attacked Nala, Myra's energy would waver ever so slightly, though the serpent made swift work of them. Meanwhile, on the other end of the village, Myra had summoned her second group of her most trusted allies, a summoning spell given and taught to her by her grandmother. The witch had 7 soldiers at her disposal, stone warriors that wielded weapons and shields and fought like knights. They were much smaller than the average warrior, but their size was never a hindrance. Their size had actually benefited the witch, as not much energy expenditure was used to keep them active. As for the rest of the Hellborn, Myra had lifted them up in the air and closed in her purple orb-like spear, then slammed them to the ground. Thunder echoed throughout the sky, but not loud enough to mask the sound of their broken bones. Myra had fought 2 hellhounds before, These Hellborn monsters were mere insects to her. However, by now, the other group of Hellborn making their way to the other village would have heard the commotion, thus retreating to the forest. But there was one Hellborn monster who seized the opportunity. This is where their sapient nature became dangerous. The creature-like man snuck his way away from Nala, the stone soldiers, and the battle itself. He crept up behind Myra, giggling under his breath, showing his rotten, foul teeth. He tightened the grip on his spear handle, waiting to pierce the spine of the witch. Though she was unaware, for her energy and her focus were taken up by her own summoning magic. However, just as the monster recoiled the weapon to impale, Lancelot leaped off Mournrog's back and pounced on the Hellborn. The goblin removed a small dagger from his pocket harness and attacked the monster in the neck, falling on top of him from the momentum. The creature felt its life draining from its filthy body, but Lancelot never stopped. All that torture in hell, all that bullying, the mockery, the beatings, and the pain that came from it was now controlling the actions of the goblin. However, Myra had quickly grabbed the goblin, smacking the dagger away. Lancelot, with tears of anger, yelled and spat at the Hellborn monster on the ground.
That's what you get,
he said angrily, but then his voice became shaky. Those angry tears had turned to sorrow, and he said,
That's what you get.
His voice now soft and fragile before completely breaking down. Myra knelt down, holding the goblin tightly against her chest. His head was tucked underneath her chin as he sobbed uncontrollably. It's okay, she whispered to him. Shh, it's okay, my friend. Everything is going to be okay. Mournrog had tears rolling down his furry face as he witnessed how much of pain his friend had endured for all these years. Such was the life of a goblin servant working in hell, not by choice but against his will. And he endured such a fate with the false belief that his father, locked up in a dungeon in hell, would be released from his debt. Lancelot only found out a month ago that Zalza had killed his father on the very first day. But now the second village of Houndsville was successfully defended. This battle and the victory that followed would not have been anywhere near that level of easy if the folk of Houndsville were not evacuated. The witch, goblin, and hellhound composed themselves, resting for a spell as they look ahead. By now, the hellborn monsters that were in the vacant village would have retreated to the woods. They would now know it was a trap, thus regrouping from whence they came for a new strategy. However, the poor hellborn monsters had no idea that Belru would be waiting for them. Hence Myra would now have to make haste to the woods, as the legendary werewolf had a plan of his own. No matter what happens, the Hellborn cannot leave the woods. More so, they cannot be scared away by the sight of Belru. Though the Hellhound thought, what about the remaining village in Houndsville? Did the Reaper actually find someone to defend it? Or was that the village going to cost the allies their victory? Chapter 4: The Legendary Werewolf. The Hellborn party that fled the previous village, running back to the woods, was surprised to see an old man sitting on a large rock. Not old as in elderly, rather old as in ancient. He was a slender man with more wrinkles than one could count. His hair long and white with shades of brown blowing in the strong wind. He wore an old robe-like cloak, but underneath, his black village pants was barely visible. The monsters, well, they were baffled. One group had been panting like animals, fleeing the Hellhound and the witch, while the other group was fresh and confused. So they spoke among themselves, talking about everything that just happened. The plan forward would be to escape from the portal they came from. However, that was never actually their plan when they were sent to the human land. The Crones told the Hellborn before departure the portal was a one-way ticket. It could allow people out but never in. Then their focus drifted towards the old man on the rock. Should they kill him? Should they spare him? What if he was one of their own from hell, someone higher up in the ranks that came to supervise them? Who knew? Maybe the Crones sent him. And so they asked the old man in their language, "Who are you?" But the old man doesn't respond. He whistles. He was concentrating, counting down from 120 in his mind. Myra, Lancelot, and Mournrog reached the woodland location, just as confused as the monsters. Who was this old man and where the hell was Belru? Then the old man stood up from the rock, his back arched and fragile. He was at the 60 mark in his countdown. He called out to the witch, commanding her to hurry up with the spell. Myra's eyes widen with shock. "It cannot be," she says. That disbelief was meant to remain silent, though her words refused to be cornered. She quickly snaps out of it and performs an incantation that encloses the woods with large purple gates. Not just your ordinary backyard village gate, but the tall and strong type, ones that dwarfed the trees. The gates were burning with purple flames, and anyone who touched it would not have any fingers left. The witch, goblin, and hellhound stood outside the enclosure, watching the Hellborn run towards the barrier and disintegrate into ash. The old man's count was now down to 5, and he gave a nod of approval to the witch. Then he made a gesture with his head and eyes for the allies to leave and find the Reaper. A message that said, "Don't worry, I've got this." And as the allies had left, time was up. The old man began laughing, but it sounded ominous, like he was driven by insanity. However, this wasn't any ordinary old man. This was Belru, and his werewolf transformation was a sight to behold. His bones in his shoulders dislocated first, then the elbow joints gave way. His kneecaps pushed forward and the bones tore through the skin. But he laughed, like this pain was a mere tickle. Then he began peeling the skin from his body, tearing it, like the human being on the outside was a mere suit. His jaw clenched, but his teeth loosened, as fangs grew and pushed out the mouth. Brown fur began covering his body, and his fingernails more like claws, long and sharp enough to slice through metal. His eyes glowed white, and the Hellborn had never been more frightened in their damned lives. Now they were locked inside this place with the legendary werewolf. Without hesitation, panic took over as the Hellborn ran towards the magical barriers. They knew they were running to their doom, and yet it would be less painful than fighting Belru. Though a few of them had wondered if their red eyes had deceived them, for special class werewolves like Belru could not revert to their human bodies ever again. So how did he do it? For now, that shall remain a secret. Sadly, their feeble thoughts in their empty minds would soon come to an end. The werewolf hunted these monsters down like they were his prey. Bites, claw swipes, punches, elbows, throws, and slams. It was the Hellborn's worst nightmare. Their numbers were now in the lesser hundreds, but those foolish enough had struck Belru with their silver weapons. He paused and looked at them with a bewildered look on his face. What on earth was silver going to do to a special class werewolf? However, Belru then got bored. This was too easy for him. Where was the fight? Where was the challenge? And so he returned to the large rock and grabbed an apple from a brown sack. While one hand was occupied, the other was free to claw them apart. It wasn't just his strength that frightened them so, but to see a werewolf of that size with his glowing white eyes, moving quicker than most vampires do, then what could the Hellborn possibly do in that situation? From 50 to 40 in less than a minute. Belru then threw the apple core on the ground. "Wait," he told them. He walked to get another apple, then sat on the rock and spoke to the remaining Hellborn.
It's okay, don't look so scared. Rest of your Hellborn have probably reached the undervillage by now.
few more hundred at least. Belru Caesar timed it perfectly as Myra's spell began wearing off.
Go to that village. Go to your friends and help them because, trust me, they're going to need it. Not a single drop of Hellborn blood will be wasted in that village, I assure you. And I'm sure he'll send some of you back to hell anyway. So you fools go back to Jorah when my friend is done with you, and tell her that I'm coming for her next. Shoo, get, run along now.
What choice did the Hellborn have? The first wave of monsters was a joke. Did they seriously think the Grim Reaper would not plan accordingly? Or maybe the Monster Council thought Death would abandon his plan since he no longer had Ragnar. Nevertheless, as the Hellborn run to the last village of Houndsville, completely unaware of who awaits them, the Reaper had reached the portal from where the monsters had come from. However, will Death be able to close the portal created by the Crones? Or was he weaker than he was letting on? To be continued.